The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in 2012, 16 years after 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker vanished from a Texas City sidewalk. When Detective Miguel Ramirez told Jean Baker they'd arrested her daughter's killer, the coffee cup slipped from Jean's trembling hands, shattering against the kitchen floor like her world had shattered that March evening in 1996. Kevin Edison Smith, the quiet refinery worker who'd fixed neighbors' cars and attended church picnics, had been hiding in plain sight all along, his DNA finally matching evidence from Crystal's dress. For over a decade, this small Gulf Coast community had wondered who among them was capable of such evil. The answer had been grilling burgers at their barbecues, sitting 3 pews behind them at Sunday service, pumping their gas with oil-stained hands that had once strangled an innocent child. Sometimes the monster you're hunting has been watching you search all along. Before we get into the story, drop a comment with your country and the time right now. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked sidewalks of Texas City as 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker slammed the screen door behind her. The sound echoed through the modest house like a gunshot, rattling the windows and disturbing the careful quiet that Grandma Louise had been trying to maintain all morning. "Crystal Jean, you get back in here right now," Louise called from the kitchen, her voice sharp with authority that had commanded respect in countless classrooms during her 40 years as a school secretary. But the only answer was the distant sound of sneakers slapping against concrete, growing fainter with each step. Louise pressed her face against the window screen, watching her granddaughter's denim jacket flutter in the Gulf breeze as the girl marched down the sidewalk with the determined stride of someone who believed the world owed her better than chores and homework on a beautiful Saturday morning in March 1996. The argument had started over something small, dishes left in the sink, an unfinished math assignment, but had escalated with the swift intensity that seemed to define every interaction between the headstrong teenager and her equally stubborn grandmother. Jean Baker, Crystal's mother, was pulling a double shift at Mickey's Diner, trying to make ends meet after her husband's departure the previous year had left them scraping by on tips and determination. "She'll be back," Louise murmured to herself, but the words felt hollow. Something in Crystal's eyes had looked different today, wilder, more desperate. The kind of look that came from feeling trapped with no way out except through whatever door presented itself first. By afternoon, the shadows had shifted and lengthened, but Crystal hadn't returned. Louise paced the small living room, her sensible shoes wearing a path in the carpet between the front window and the kitchen table, where Crystal's breakfast dishes still sat, abandoned in the aftermath of their morning fight. The clock on the mantel ticked with mechanical indifference, each second stretching into eternity. At the Gulf Mart convenience store near Interstate 45, a security camera captured grainy footage of a girl in a denim jacket using the payphone outside. She kept glancing over her shoulder, nervously scanning the traffic streaming past on the highway. The call lasted 3 minutes, long enough to leave a message, not long enough for a real conversation. When she hung up the receiver, she stood for a moment in the parking lot, looking lost and smaller than her 13 years. A trucker named Danny Hawkins later remembered seeing a young girl walking along the shoulder of I-45, thumb extended toward oncoming traffic. The image stuck with him just long enough to mention it to his wife when he got home to Louisiana, then faded into the background noise of 1,000 highway memories. By evening, Jean Baker's 1987 Honda was crawling through every street in their neighborhood, headlights cutting through, gathering dusk as mother and grandmother called Crystal's name into the growing darkness. They checked the school playground, the shopping center, the beach where teenagers sometimes gathered to watch the sunset paint the Gulf in shades of gold and crimson. Maybe she went to stay with a friend, Jean said, but her voice carried the hollow ring of desperate hope. Crystal's friends had been calling the house all afternoon, wondering if she wanted to go to the movies or hang out at the mall. None of them had seen her since Friday at school. The phone calls to other parents began around 9 o'clock, each conversation a variation on the same theme. "Have you seen Crystal? She left this morning after an argument with her grandmother. No, she didn't take any clothes. Yes, we've checked everywhere we can think of." By midnight, the Chambers County Sheriff's Department had opened a missing person file. Deputy Frank Morrison, a 20-year veteran who'd seen enough runaway cases to recognize the pattern, filled out the paperwork with practiced efficiency while Jean sat in a plastic chair, her uniform from Mickey's Diner stained with coffee and tears. "Most kids come home within 24 hours, Morrison said gently. "They get scared, get hungry, realize home wasn't so bad after all." But something in Jean's hollow stare told him this case might be different. Dawn on the 6th of March brought no relief, only the cruel mockery of another beautiful spring morning. The Trinity River moved with lazy indifference beneath the concrete span of Highway 146, its brown waters carrying the debris of civilization toward Galveston Bay. 2 fishermen, Jim Cordova and his teenage son Miguel, had launched their small aluminum boat before sunrise, hoping to catch the morning bite when bass moved into shallow water to feed. It was Miguel who first spotted something unusual. Tangled in the bridge supports a flash of color that didn't belong in the natural palette of water and concrete. "Dad, look over there," he said, pointing toward the shadow cast by the bridge's massive pylons. Jim Cordova had been fishing these waters for 30 years, long enough to know the difference between trash and tragedy. As their boat drew closer, the terrible truth became clear. What they had found wasn't debris from last week's storm, it was someone's daughter, someone's granddaughter, someone's entire world floating face down in the murky water. The call went out over police radios at 6:47 a.m. "We have a body in the water at the 146 bridge. Female appears to be juvenile. Request homicide and crime scene units." Detective Ray Sullivan had been investigating crimes in Chambers County for 15 years, but his hands still shook slightly as he photographed the scene. The victim wore a yellow sundress that Jean Baker would later identify as Crystal's favorite, the one she'd worn to church just 2 Sundays before. Ligature marks on her neck told a story that no parent should ever have to hear. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed what everyone at the scene already knew but hoped wasn't true. Crystal Jean Baker had been sexually assaulted and strangled, her young life snuffed out by someone who saw her not as a person but as an object to be used and discarded. Jean Baker arrived at the scene as crime scene technicians were loading her daughter's body into the coroner's van. The sound that escaped her throat was something between a scream and a prayer, raw and primal and utterly heartbreaking. She collapsed to her knees on the bridge's concrete sidewalk, Louise catching her before she could fall completely. "No, no, no," John whispered, the words becoming a mantra against reality. She was supposed to come home. She always comes home. The investigation that followed consumed the Chambers County Sheriff's Department like nothing they'd seen before. Within hours, every available detective was assigned to the case, their usual duties suspended in favor of finding whoever had killed Crystal Baker. The state crime lab fast-tracked the evidence DNA samples from beneath Crystal's fingernails, fibers from her clothing, a single dark hair found on her dress. But the physical evidence told only part of the story. The real investigation would unfold in the spaces between what could be proven and what could be suspected, in the uncomfortable silences during neighborhood interviews and the way certain people couldn't quite meet the detective's eyes when asked about their whereabouts on the 5th of March. Detective Sullivan walked the route from Louise Baker's house to the convenience store where Crystal had made her last phone call, measuring distances and calculating timeframes. Whoever had taken her had acted quickly and decisively, suggesting either careful planning or dangerous opportunism. The stretch of highway where the trucker had seen her hitchhiking was just isolated enough to provide cover for someone with predatory intent. The crime lab results came back 3 weeks later with disappointing news. The DNA samples were too degraded to yield a usable profile. The fiber evidence was too common to be distinctive, and the hair fragment lacked sufficient root material for genetic testing. In 1996, forensic science was advancing rapidly, but it hadn't yet reached the precision that would become standard in the following decade. "We'll keep working it," Sullivan promised Jean during one of their weekly meetings at the sheriff's department. "Sometimes these cases take time, but we don't give up." He meant every word, but already the pressure was building to allocate resources to newer cases with better prospects for resolution. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. Volunteers organized search parties that combed every vacant lot and abandoned building within a 20-mile radius of Texas City. Vigils were held at 3 different churches, each one packed with neighbors who hadn't spoken to the Baker family in years but now felt compelled to demonstrate their solidarity against the evil that had invaded their collective peace of mind. But solidarity has a shelf life, and as weeks turned to months without an arrest, the community's attention began to drift toward more immediate concern. The volunteers stopped calling, the vigils became sparsely attended, and conversations about Crystal Baker shifted from "who could have done this" to "I always thought that girl was headed for trouble." The whispered judgments were perhaps the cruelest part of all. Crystal had been a normal teenager, sometimes rebellious, occasionally defiant, prone to testing boundaries the way 13-year-olds have done since the beginning of time. But in death, her normal adolescent behavior was reframed as evidence of recklessness, as if somehow she had been partially responsible for her own murder. Jean heard the whispers in grocery store checkout lines and church fellowship halls. She was running with a rough crowd. Her mother worked too much, never home to supervise properly. What was she doing on the highway by herself in the first place? Each comment was a fresh wound, a suggestion that Crystal's death was somehow preventable if only Jean had been a better mother. If only Louise had been less strict, if only their family had made different choices. The victim blaming was subtle but persistent, part of the community's unconscious need to create distance between what had happened to the Bakers and what could happen to them. By Thanksgiving 1996, the Crystal Baker case file had grown to over 300 pages of reports, interviews, and laboratory results that collectively painted a picture of a crime without clear suspects or obvious motives. Detective Sullivan kept the case on his active roster, but new murders and rapes demanded his attention with the urgency that only fresh evidence can provide. The case wasn't officially declared cold, but the signs were unmistakable. Fewer follow-up calls to Jean, longer intervals between progress reports, and the gradual shift from "when we catch him" to "if new evidence emerges." On what would have been Crystal's 14th birthday, Jean Baker sat alone in her daughter's bedroom, surrounded by stuffed animals and boy band posters that had become monuments to interrupted dreams. She lit a candle on the small cake she'd bought out of habit, watching the flame flicker in the gathering darkness while somewhere in their small Texas town, A killer was living his normal life with apparent impunity. The late 1990 seconds brought change to Texas City with the relentless pace of progress. Strip malls sprouted where cotton fields had once stretched toward the horizon, chain restaurants replaced local diners, and newcomers arrived to work at the expanding petrochemical plants along the Gulf Coast. The town that had once been defined by tight-knit neighborhoods and multi-generational families was slowly transforming into something larger and more anonymous. For Jean Baker, the changes were both blessing and curse. New faces meant fewer people who remembered the details of March 1996. Fewer pitying looks in the grocery store. Fewer whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she walked by. But the anonymity also meant fewer people who remembered Crystal, fewer who understood why Jean couldn't simply move on the way well-meaning friends and family kept suggesting. Mickey's Diner, where Jean had worked double shifts to support her family, closed in 1998 when the owner retired and sold the property to a chain restaurant. Jean took a job at the Walmart that opened on the outskirts of town, finding comfort in the routine of stocking shelves and helping customers find what they needed. The work was mindless enough to allow her thoughts to drift, but structured enough to get her through each day without falling apart completely. Louise Baker aged dramatically in the years following Crystal's death, her formerly sharp mind becoming increasingly fragmented by grief and guilt. She spent hours sitting in Crystal's room, folding and refolding the same clothes, as if maintaining perfect order could somehow undo the chaos that had claimed her granddaughter's life. "I should have made her stay," Louise would say during her more lucid moments. "Should have locked the door, hidden her shoes, something, anything." The guilt consumed her slowly but thoroughly, manifesting in a compulsive need to know where Jean was at all times, to have constant assurance that she wasn't going to lose the only family she had left. Phone calls to Jean's workplace became a daily occurrence, then an hourly one, until Jean had to ask her supervisor for permission to disconnect the phone at her station. Detective Ray Sullivan retired in 2001, turning over his active cases to younger investigators who brought fresh eyes but less institutional memory to the work. Crystal's file was transferred to Detective Bill Hoffman, a competent investigator who reviewed the evidence thoroughly but found no new angles to pursue. The physical evidence remained insufficient for prosecution, and the few potential suspects had solid alibis or had moved out of state, beyond the practical reach of a county sheriff's department operating on a limited budget. The annual vigils for Crystal continued, but attendance dwindled as the core group of organizers either moved away or found other causes to occupy their time. By 2005, the 5th of March Remembrance drew fewer than a dozen participants, most of them elderly church members who attended out of habit rather than any specific connection to the Baker family. Jean never missed a vigil, arriving early to arrange flowers and staying late to clean up the memorial candles that flickered, against the growing darkness of another year without answers. She had developed a ritual around these gatherings, the same prayer, the same speech about keeping Crystal's memory alive, the same plea for anyone with information to come forward. The words had become polished through repetition, but the emotion behind them remained as raw as it had been on the day they found Crystal's body in the Trinity River. In 2006, 10 years after the murder, the Houston Chronicle ran a retrospective article about unsolved crimes in Southeast Texas. Crystal's case merited 3 paragraphs in a story that covered dozens of cold cases. Her photo reduced to a small black and white image alongside a brief recap of the known facts. The article generated a few phone calls to the sheriff's department, mostly from psychics and amateur sleuths who had watched too many crime shows but no legitimate leads. Jean kept a copy of the article in her purse, folded and refolded until the paper began to tear along the creases. On particularly difficult days, she would take it out and read those 3 paragraphs like a prayer. Proof that someone besides herself still remembered that Crystal Jean Baker had existed, had mattered, had been more than just another statistic in the endless catalog of unsolved crimes. The technological revolution of the early 2010s was largely invisible to Jean, who had never owned a computer and viewed cell phones as expensive luxuries. But in law enforcement circles, the advent of digital databases and improved DNA analysis techniques was quietly revolutionizing cold case investigations. The FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, was expanding rapidly, allowing local investigators to compare evidence from unsolved cases against DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the entire country. Detective Miguel Ramirez joined the Chambers County Sheriff's Department in 2008, part of a new generation of investigators who had grown up with technology and saw cold cases not as dead ends but as puzzles waiting for the right combination of science and persistence to unlock their secrets. His first assignment was to review all unsolved homicides from the previous 15 years, looking for cases that might benefit from modern analytical techniques. The Crystal Baker file caught his attention immediately, not because of any overlooked evidence or investigative errors, but because of the detailed notes that Detective Sullivan had maintained throughout his years on the case. Sullivan had been methodical in his documentation, preserving not just the physical evidence but also his thought processes, his hunches, and his growing frustration with the limitations of 1990 seconds forensic science. "This isn't a whodunit," Ramirez wrote in his case review memo. This is a matter of waiting for science to catch up with the crime. In November 2009, Ramirez drove to the state crime lab in Austin with a cardboard box containing everything that remained of the physical evidence from Crystal's murder. Her yellow dress, carefully preserved in climate-controlled storage, scrapings from beneath her fingernails, the hair fragment found on her clothing, and several other trace materials that had been collected at the crime scene. The crime lab had been transformed since 1996, equipped with sophisticated instruments that could extract usable DNA profiles from samples that would have been considered worthless by earlier standards. Dr. Sarah Chen, the lab's senior DNA analyst, examined the evidence with the careful attention of someone who understood that she might be holding the key to 13 years of unanswered questions. The dress is our best bet, Dr. Chen explained to Ramirez during his second visit to the lab. There's biological material here that wasn't detectable with the technology available in the 1,990 seconds. It's going to take time, but I think we can develop a profile. The extraction process took 6 weeks, each step requiring precise temperature control and chemical treatment that pushed the limits of forensic science. But in January 2010, Dr. Chen called Ramirez with news that sent electric excitement through the Chambers County Sheriff's Department. They had successfully isolated a complete DNA profile from biological material found on Crystal's dress. Male, single source, suitable for CODIS database comparison, Dr. Chen reported. Whoever this belongs to will know it when his DNA gets entered into the system. The profile was uploaded to CODIS on the 15th of February, 2010. Then began the passive process of comparison against the DNA records of convicted offenders throughout the United States. CODIS searches were automated, running continuously in the background of law enforcement computer systems, looking for matches between evidence from unsolved crimes and DNA samples from people who had been arrested for other offenses. Jean Baker knew none of this when Detective Ramirez called her in March 2010 to provide what had become an annual update on her daughter's case. But for the first time in 14 years, he had something genuinely hopeful to report. We have DNA, he told her simply. Clear, usable DNA from the person who killed Crystal, and we're comparing it against every criminal in the country. When we find him, and we will find him, there won't be any doubt. Jean sat in her kitchen, holding the phone with hands that trembled slightly, afraid to believe that this conversation was really happening after so many years of disappointment and dead ends. How long? She asked. How long, before you know something? Could be days, could be years, Ramirez admitted. Depends on when and if our guy gets arrested for something else and has his DNA taken. But, Jean, I want you to understand something. This changes everything. We're not looking for him anymore. We're waiting for him to find us. That night, Jean lay awake, staring at the ceiling of her small bedroom, listening to the familiar sounds of her neighborhood settling into sleep. Somewhere out there, perhaps in this very town, perhaps sleeping peacefully just a few streets away, was the person who had murdered her daughter. He had been walking free for 14 years, going about his daily life while she lived in suspended animation, waiting for justice that had seemed increasingly unlikely with each passing year. But now, for the first time since March 1996, Jean Baker allowed herself to hope. Kevin Edison Smith had been living in Groves, Texas for 8 years when his past finally caught up with him in the form of a routine traffic stop that escalated into something much more serious. It was the 15th of September, 2010, and Smith was driving home from his shift at the Motiva refinery when he made the mistake of running a red light in front of a Louisiana State Police patrol car that happened to be crossing the border on a joint drug enforcement operation. The initial stop should have been routine, a traffic citation, and a warning to be more careful. But when Trooper Michelle Landry ran Smith's license through the system, she discovered outstanding warrants for unpaid fines in Jefferson County, Texas. What should have been a 10-minute interaction on the side of the road became a trip to the Calcasieu Parish Jail, where Smith was booked on the outstanding warrants and held for transfer back to Texas. Louisiana law required DNA samples from all individuals arrested on out-of-state warrants, part of a growing trend toward genetic databases that law enforcement agencies were using to solve cold cases and identify repeat offenders. Smith provided the sample with the resigned compliance of someone who had been through the booking process before, probably assuming that his DNA would join millions of others in a digital database that would never be relevant to his life. The sample was processed at the Louisiana State Police Crime Lab, then uploaded to CODIS as part of the routine data entry that happened every day in law enforcement agencies across the country. Computer algorithms began comparing Smith's genetic profile against evidence from thousands of unsolved crimes, searching for matches that would connect past crimes to present suspects. The match hit on the 28th of September, 2010, generating an automated alert that was forwarded to Detective Miguel Ramirez at the Chambers County Sheriff's Department. After 14 years and 7 months of investigation, the murder of Crystal Jean Baker had finally found its perpetrator in a database maintained by computers that never slept, never gave up, and never forgot. Ramirez was sitting at his desk working through paperwork on a domestic violence case. when his computer chimed with the CODIS alert. He had been waiting for this moment for nearly a year, but seeing Smith's name and photograph on his screen still sent adrenaline surging through his system like an electric shock. Kevin Edison Smith, age 44, had been living and working in Southeast Texas since the early 1990s. His criminal record was relatively minor: a few drug possession charges, some traffic violations, a disorderly conduct arrest from 2003, but the geographical overlap with Crystal's murder was impossible to ignore. In 1996, Smith had been employed at a chemical plant in Texas City, working the night shift that would have left his days free for whatever activities had led him to cross paths with a 13-year-old girl on the worst day of her life. The investigation that followed moved with the swift efficiency of a case that had been building momentum for over a decade. Ramirez coordinated with Texas Rangers and local police departments to gather every piece of information available about Smith's life, his employment history, his known associates, and his movements in March 1996. What they found painted a found in round picture of a man who had managed to hide in plain sight for his entire adult life. Smith was described by coworkers as quiet and competent, someone who did his job without complaint and rarely socialized outside of work. His neighbors in Groves knew him as a polite but distant figure who kept his small rental house neat and his old pickup truck in good repair. But there were darker elements beneath the surface of Smith's carefully constructed normalcy. A former girlfriend told investigators that Smith had been physically and emotionally abusive during their relationship in the late 1990s, prone to sudden rages that seemed to come from nowhere. She had ended the relationship after he threatened to kill her dog when she talked about breaking up with him. He was two different people, she said during her interview with Ramirez. Most of the time he was fine, quiet, almost shy, but when he got angry, it was like something else took over. His eyes would change, and you could see that he wanted to hurt you. A search warrant for Smith's residence turned up several items that investigators found disturbing, though not directly connected to Crystal's murder. Newspaper clippings about missing children cases, several true crime books, and a collection of photographs that appeared to have been taken surreptitiously of young women in public places. The arrest warrant was signed on the 12th of October, 2010, charging Kevin Edison Smith with capital murder in the death of Crystal Jean Baker. The coordinated arrest operation involved Texas Rangers, Chambers County deputies, and Jefferson County Police, a show of force designed to ensure that Smith didn't have an opportunity to run or resist. They found him at the Motiva refinery at 6:15 a.m., walking across the employee parking lot toward his pickup truck at the end of his shift. He didn't run when he saw the police cars, didn't struggle when they approached him with guns drawn, didn't ask for a lawyer when they read him his rights. He simply stood in the morning sun with his hands behind his back while they fitted the handcuffs, as if he had been expecting this moment for 14 years. Kevin Smith, you're under arrest for the murder of Crystal Jean Baker, Ramirez said, his voice steady despite the emotions churning beneath the surface. You have the right to remain silent. The news of Smith's arrest spread through the Gulf Coast communities like wildfire, transmitted through phone calls, text messages, and social media posts that carried the stunning revelation that Crystal Baker's killer had finally been caught. Local television stations interrupted regular programming with breaking news alerts, and the story made front-page headlines in newspapers from Houston to New Orleans. But nowhere was the impact more profound than in the small house on Avenue L in Texas City, where Jean Baker was getting ready for another day of work at Walmart when her phone rang at 7:30 a.m. on the 12th of October, 2010. Jean, this is Detective Ramirez. The voice on the other end said, I need you to sit down. We got him. We arrested the man who killed Crystal. The coffee cup slipped from Jean's hand, shattering against the kitchen floor in a crash that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence that followed Ramirez's words. She sank into a chair at the small table where she had eaten thousands of lonely meals over the past 14 years, trying to process information that her mind had been waiting to hear for so long that it almost seemed unreal. Are you sure? She whispered. Are you absolutely sure? His DNA matches the evidence from Crystal's dress, Ramirez said gently. There's no doubt, Jean. We found him. The name Kevin Edison Smith meant nothing to Jean Baker when Detective Ramirez first spoke it during that life-changing phone call on October 2010. But as details emerged about the man who had murdered her daughter, Jean realized with growing horror that Smith had been hiding in plain sight throughout the 14 years of her search for justice. Church records showed that Smith had attended services at Galilee Baptist, the same small congregation where the Baker family had worshipped before Crystal's death drove Jean away from organized religion. Pastor Ray Holloway remembered Smith as a quiet presence in the back pews, someone who attended sporadically but always dressed neatly and contributed modestly to the collection plate. He was unremarkable, Pastor Holloway told reporters who descended on Texas City in the wake of the arrest. That's what makes this so difficult to understand. He seemed like someone who was trying to live a good life, trying to be better than whatever had come before. The most disturbing revelations came from neighbors in the subdivision where Smith had lived during the 1,990 seconds, just 3 miles from the Baker family home. Several residents recalled hiring Smith to do odd jobs, car repairs, yard work, small home improvements, and being impressed with his workmanship and reasonable prices. He had been particularly popular with elderly residents who appreciated his willingness to help with tasks that had become too difficult for them to manage alone. He fixed my air conditioner in the summer of '96, recalled Dorothy Martinez, an 80-year-old widow who lived 2 streets away from the Bakers. Did a good job, charged a fair price, was real polite. You never would have thought. Her voice trailed off as she contemplated the implications of having invited a child killer into her home. The geographic proximity was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. Smith's various addresses over the years formed a rough circle around Texas City, never more than a few miles from where Crystal had lived and died. He had shopped at the same grocery stores, eaten at the same restaurants, and driven the same roads where search parties had looked for clues to his identity. Jean learned that Smith had even attended one of the early memorial vigils for Crystal, standing at the back of the crowd while she spoke about her daughter's life and pleaded for information about her death. The thought that he had been there, listening to her grief and feeding on her pain, was almost too horrible to contemplate. The investigation into Smith's background revealed a pattern of geographic mobility that investigators now recognized as potentially significant. He had lived in Louisiana, Alabama, and Mississippi before settling in Texas, always moving on after a few years, always finding work in industrial settings where his technical skills were valued and his personal life remained private. Detective Ramirez worked with law enforcement agencies in Smith's former locations, looking for unsolved cases that might be connected to his presence in their communities. The results were troubling, but not conclusive. Several missing children cases and one unsolved rape that bore similarities to Crystal's murder, but no DNA evidence that could definitively link Smith to additional crimes. He's been doing this for a long time, Ramirez confided to Jean during one of their regular meetings as the case moved toward trial. Crystal may not have been his first victim, and she might not have been his last if we hadn't caught it, but proving that in court is going to be nearly impossible. The legal proceedings that followed were both vindication and ordeal for Jean Baker. Prosecutor Claire Bennett, a veteran of dozens of high-profile cases, approached Smith's trial with the methodical precision of someone who understood that DNA evidence was only as strong as the legal framework that supported it. Science will convict him, Bennett explained to Jean during their first meeting. But science alone isn't enough. We need to tell Crystal's story, help the jury understand who she was and what was taken from her. That's where your testimony becomes crucial. The preparation process was emotionally devastating. Jean had to relive every detail of the 5th of March, 1996, describing her daughter's final argument with Louise, reconstructing the timeline of Crystal's last day, and confronting the reality of what had happened to her daughter in the hours between her disappearance and the discovery of her body. Dr. Sarah Chen, the DNA analyst who had developed Smith's genetic profile, would serve as the prosecution's key technical witness. Her testimony would need to explain complex scientific procedures to jurors who might struggle to understand the significance of DNA evidence, making the connection between biological material found on Crystal's dress and the man sitting at the defense table. The DNA match is perfect, Dr. Chen explained during her pre-trial preparation sessions with Bennett. The probability that this genetic profile could belong to someone other than Kevin Smith is less than 1 in 100 billion. But I need to communicate that certainty in language that ordinary people can understand. Smith's defense attorney, a court-appointed public defender named Marcus Webb, faced the nearly impossible task of creating reasonable doubt in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence. His strategy centered on challenging the chain of custody for the evidence and raising questions about contamination during the 14 years between the crime and the DNA analysis. DNA evidence is only as reliable as the people who collected it and the procedures they followed, Webb argued during pretrial motions. This evidence has been sitting in storage for over a decade. Who knows what could have happened to it during that time? But the prosecution's case was built on more than just DNA. Investigators had discovered that Smith's work schedule in March 1996 had given him the afternoon of the 5th of March off, placing him in the area at the time of Crystal's disappearance. His pickup truck, still in his possession when he was arrested, matched the general description of a vehicle seen near the convenience store where Crystal had made her final phone call. The trial began on the 15th of April, 2012, in the Chambers County Courthouse, a modest building that had rarely seen the kind of media attention that Smith's case generated. Television trucks lined the streets outside, and every seat in the courtroom was filled with reporters, law enforcement personnel, and residents who had followed the case since its beginning. Jean Baker sat in the front row, flanked by Pastor Holloway and Detective Ramirez, wearing the simple black dress she had bought specifically for this occasion. She had waited 16 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, she felt strangely calm, as if her entire adult life had been preparation for these few days when justice would finally be served. Smith entered the courtroom in shackles. His appearance dramatically changed from the confident man who had once charmed his way into neighbors' homes and church fellowship halls. 16 years of carrying the secret of his crime had aged him prematurely. His hair gone completely gray, his shoulders bent as if under the weight of his guilt. He never looked at Jean during the trial, never acknowledged her presence in any way, as if maintaining the fiction that she didn't exist might somehow make the entire proceedings less real. But Jean watched him constantly, studying his face for any sign of remorse or recognition of the devastation he had caused. Prosecutor Bennett's opening statement was devastating in its simplicity. 16 years ago, Kevin Edison Smith took the life of 13-year-old Crystal Jean Baker. He sexually assaulted her, he strangled her, and he threw her body in a river like she was nothing more than garbage. Today, science has given us the tools to prove what we could not prove in 1996, that this man is a killer, and that he must be held accountable for his crime. Dr. Chen's testimony consumed most of the second day of trial, as she walked the jury through the complex process of DNA extraction and comparison. Using charts and graphs, she explained how biological material preserved on Crystal's dress had yielded a complete genetic profile that matched Kevin Smith's DNA with mathematical certainty. The likelihood that this DNA profile could belong to anyone other than the defendant is approximately 1 in 100 billion, Dr. Chen told the jury. To put that in perspective, there are only about 7 billion people on Earth. The scientific evidence is absolute. Kevin Smith's DNA is on Crystal Baker's dress. The defense's cross-examination of Dr. Chen focused on technical details about evidence, storage, and the possibility of contamination, but Webb's questions seemed to have little impact on the jury. The science was simply too overwhelming, too definitive to be effectively challenged by procedural arguments. Jean's testimony on the third day was the emotional centerpiece of the trial. Bennett had prepared her carefully for this moment, but nothing could have made it easy to stand in front of a packed courtroom and describe the loss of her daughter to the man who had killed her. Crystal was full of life, Jean said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She was stubborn and funny and smart, and she had her whole future ahead of her. She wanted to be a teacher, maybe work with little kids. She loved to draw and write stories. She was just a normal 13-year-old girl who got into an argument with her grandmother and made a bad decision to leave the house. Jean's voice broke slightly as she continued. But that bad decision shouldn't have cost her everything. No child should pay with their life for being young and impulsive. Kevin Smith took away her dreams, her future, everything she might have become. And he took away my daughter, my only child, the center of my whole world. Webb's cross-examination of Jean was brief and respectful, focusing on the timeline of events rather than challenging her emotional testimony. Even the defense seemed to recognize that attacking a grieving mother would likely backfire with the jury. The prosecution's case concluded with testimony from Detective Ramirez about the investigation, and Detective Sullivan, who had come out of retirement to testify about the original crime scene evidence. Their combined testimony painted a picture of a thorough investigation that had been limited only by the technology available in 1996, but had preserved crucial evidence that modern science could finally interpret. The defense's case was minimal, consisting primarily of character witnesses who testified about Smith's reputation as a reliable employee and quiet neighbor. Webb called Dr. Martin Fisher, a forensic scientist from Dallas who raised theoretical questions about DNA degradation over time, but admitted under cross-examination that he had found no evidence of actual contamination in this case. Smith himself never testified, exercising his constitutional right to remain silent. His decision not to take the stand was probably wise from a legal standpoint, but it meant that the jury never heard any explanation for his presence at the crime scene or any expression of remorse for his actions. Closing arguments began on the afternoon of the 18th of April. Bennett's presentation was methodical and devastating, walking the jury through the evidence step by step and addressing every argument the defense had raised. Kevin Smith had the opportunity. He was off work that afternoon, Bennett said. He had the means. He was physically capable of overpowering a 13-year-old girl. And most importantly, we have the evidence, his DNA on Crystal's dress, placed there during the commission of this terrible crime. Webb's closing argument focused on the burden of proof and the possibility of reasonable doubt, but his heart didn't seem to be in it. The evidence was simply too strong, the scientific testimony too compelling for any realistic hope of acquittal. I'm not asking you to ignore the DNA evidence, Webb told the jury. I'm asking you to consider whether the state has proven its case beyond a reasonable doubt. Is it possible that something went wrong with the evidence over 16 years? Is it possible that we don't know everything we need to know about what happened on the 5th of March 1996? But even as he spoke, Webb seemed to know that his arguments were insufficient. The DNA evidence was ironclad, and the jury's body language suggested they had already reached their verdict. The jury deliberated for just 47 minutes before returning to the courtroom with their decision. Judge Patricia Hawkins called the court to order, and foreman Robert Martinez stood to deliver the verdict that Jean Baker had been waiting 16 years to hear. We, the jury, find the defendant, Kevin Edison Smith, guilty of capital murder in the death of Crystal Jean Baker. The courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief, satisfaction, and continued grief. Jean collapsed against Pastor Holloway's shoulder, sobbing with an intensity that seemed to release 16 years of accumulated pain and frustration. Behind her, she could hear Detective Ramirez quietly saying, "Yes, yes, yes," and the scattered applause of spectators who had followed the case since its beginning. Smith showed no visible reaction to the verdict, sitting motionless at the defense table as if the proceedings were happening to someone else. He had maintained the same blank expression throughout the trial, offering no acknowledgement of the devastation he had caused or the justice that was finally being served. Judge Hawkins scheduled sentencing for the following week, giving both sides time to prepare their arguments about whether Smith should receive life in prison or the death penalty. Under Texas law, the jury would make that decision based on their assessment of Smith's future dangerousness and the deliberate nature of his crime. The sentencing phase of the trial was much shorter than the guilt phase, consisting primarily of victim impact statements from Jean and Louise Baker, and character testimony from both sides about Smith's background and potential for rehabilitation. Jean's victim impact statement was devastating in its quiet dignity. "Kevin Smith didn't just kill my daughter 16 years ago. He killed part of me too. He killed my ability to trust, my ability to feel safe, my ability to imagine a future without this terrible pain. I've spent 16 years wondering who did this to Crystal, wondering if he might hurt someone else's child. Now we know who he is, and we know he can never hurt another family the way he hurt ours." Louise Baker, now 84 and frail, spoke briefly about the guilt she had carried since the morning Crystal walked out of her house. "I should have stopped her. I should have been stronger. Should have made her stay. I've had to live with that regret every day for 16 years. But I know now that Kevin Smith is the only one who's really responsible for what happened to our Crystal." The defense presented testimony about Smith's difficult childhood and his struggles with alcohol and drug abuse, trying to create a picture of someone who deserved life in prison rather than execution. But the jury was unmoved by arguments about Smith's own suffering, particularly in the context of what he had done to an innocent child. After 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendation: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Judge Hawkins accepted the recommendation and formally sentenced Smith to spend the rest of his life in a Texas state penitentiary, ending the legal proceedings that had consumed nearly 2 years of preparation and trial. As Smith was led away in shackles, he finally turned to look at Jean Baker for the first and last time. Their eyes met for a groan, perhaps 3 seconds across the courtroom. And Jean saw something in his expression that might have been acknowledgement, or regret, or simply resignation to his fate. Then he was gone, disappearing through a side door that led to the detention area where he would wait for transport to the state prison system. The aftermath of Kevin Smith's conviction brought Jean Baker a sense of closure she had not experienced since March 1996. But it also created new challenges as she struggled to rebuild a life that had been defined by the search for justice for so many years. The trial had consumed all of her emotional energy for months, and suddenly finding herself without that focus left her feeling strangely adrift. The media attention that had surrounded the trial faded quickly, as news cycles moved on to other stories and other tragedies. Jean found herself grateful for the return to anonymity, but also somewhat disoriented by the sudden absence of reporters and cameramen who had made her feel, briefly, that Crystal's story mattered to the wider world. Detective Ramirez stayed in touch with Jean after the trial, checking in periodically to see how she was adjusting to life after the conviction. Their relationship had evolved during the investigation and trial from professional courtesy to genuine friendship, bonded by their shared commitment to finding justice for Crystal. "You know, I never really thought about what would happen after we caught him," Jean confided during one of their coffee meetings at a diner near the courthouse. "I spent so many years focused on finding Crystal's killer that I never planned for what came next." Ramirez understood her struggle better than most. He had seen other families go through similar experiences, discovering that justice, while necessary and satisfying, doesn't automatically heal the wounds left by violent crime. "The conviction doesn't bring Crystal back," he said gently, "but it does mean that her death mattered, that her life had value, that someone was held accountable for taking her away from you." In the months following the trial, Jean began to think about how she might use her experience to help other families facing similar ordeals. She had learned firsthand about the failures and limitations of the criminal justice system, but also about the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up hope. The idea for the Crystal Jean Baker Foundation emerged gradually, through conversations with other victims' families and meetings with law enforcement officials who were struggling to solve cold cases with limited resources. Jean realized that her experience, painful as it had been, had given her unique insights into the challenges facing families of murder victims and the systemic problems that allowed cases to go unsolved for years or decades. The Foundation's mission was simple but ambitious: to provide support and resources for families of cold case victims, to advocate for legislative changes that would improve investigation techniques, and to ensure that modern DNA analysis was applied to as many unsolved cases as possible. Jean's first major initiative was pushing for state legislation that would mandate regular review of cold cases and require law enforcement agencies to submit all eligible evidence for modern DNA testing. The proposed law, which became known as the Crystal Jean Baker Act, faced initial resistance from some police departments and district attorneys who worried about the cost and complexity of reviewing thousands of old cases. But Jean had learned something about advocacy during her 16-year wait for justice. She understood that change happened slowly, through persistent pressure and careful coalition building, rather than dramatic confrontations or emotional appeals. She testified before legislative committees, spoke at law enforcement conferences, and gradually built support for the idea that cold cases deserved the same attention and resources as fresh investigations. The lobbying process took 3 years and required Jean to learn skills she had never imagined, needing how to read legislative language, how to build coalitions with other advocacy groups, how to present technical information to politicians who had limited understanding of forensic science. She worked with Senator Patricia Valdez, a Democratic legislator from San Antonio who had personal experience with violent crime, to craft language that would be both effective and politically viable. The Crystal Jean Baker Act passed the Texas legislature in June 2015 and was signed into law by Governor Abbott in a ceremony attended by families of cold case victims from across the state. Jean stood beside the governor as he signed the bill, thinking about how proud Crystal would have been to see her name associated with legislation that might help solve cases that had been forgotten by the system. The law required all Texas law enforcement agencies to conduct regular reviews of unsolved homicide cases and to submit eligible evidence for DNA testing using the most advanced techniques available. It also created a state fund to help smaller departments pay for the testing, addressing one of the primary obstacles that had prevented many agencies from pursuing cold case investigations. The impact of the legislation was immediate and dramatic. Within 2 years of its implementation, Texas law enforcement agencies had cleared over 300 cold cases, including several that had been unsolved for more than 20 years. Each solved case represented a family that could finally have answers, a killer who could finally be held accountable, and a community that could finally feel safer. Jean attended several of the trials that resulted from cases solved under the Crystal Jean Baker Act, sitting in courtrooms across Texas as other families experienced the mixture of relief and grief that comes with delayed justice. She found these experiences both rewarding and emotionally challenging, as they forced her to relive her own journey through the criminal justice system. One case that particularly affected her involved the 1989 murder of 16-year-old Maria Gonzalez in El Paso, a crime that had gone unsolved for 26 years before DNA evidence identified the killer as a man who had been living freely in the community throughout the entire investigation. Maria's mother, Elena Gonzalez, had died 3 years before the arrest, never knowing that her daughter's killer would eventually be caught. "That could have been me," Jean told Pastor Holloway after attending the trial. "I could have died waiting for answers, never knowing that Crystal's killer was finally going to face justice. At least, I lived to see it happen." The success of the Texas legislation inspired similar efforts in other states, and Jean found herself traveling around the country to speak at conferences and legislative hearings about the importance of cold case reform. She testified before Congress about federal funding for DNA testing, spoke at police academies about the impact of unsolved cases on victims' families, and gradually became recognized as a national advocate for criminal justice reform. But perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Jean's advocacy work was the personal connection she made with other families who were living through their own versions of her experience. The Crystal Jean Baker Foundation maintained a support network for families of cold case victims, providing both practical assistance with navigating the legal system and emotional support for the long wait that such cases required. Jean regularly received phone calls and emails from mothers whose daughters had been murdered, fathers whose sons had disappeared, siblings who were trying to keep cases alive after their parents had given up hope. She listened to their stories with the patience of someone who understood exactly what they were going through, offering advice about working with law enforcement, managing media attention, and maintaining hope during the inevitable periods of frustration and disappointment. "The waiting is the hardest part," she would tell families who were just beginning their journey through the cold case system. "You feel like you're the only one who remembers, the only one who cares. But that's not true. There are people working on these cases, even when you can't see them, and science keeps getting better. What seemed impossible 10 years ago is routine today." By 2019, the Crystal Jean Baker Foundation had helped solve over 50 cold cases across the United States, either through direct advocacy or by providing resources that enabled law enforcement agencies to pursue investigations they might otherwise have abandoned. Each solved case felt like a small victory for Jean, proof that Crystal's death had meaning beyond the personal tragedy it represented for her family. The foundation also established a scholarship program for students pursuing careers in forensic science, criminal justice, or victim advocacy. The scholarships were modest $2.500 per year, but they carried Crystal's name into classrooms and laboratories where the next generation of investigators was learning the skills that might solve tomorrow's cold cases. As Jean approached her 60th birthday in 2018, she began to think about succession planning for the foundation and her own eventual retirement from active advocacy. The work had given her life purpose and meaning during the years after Smith's conviction, but it had also been emotionally exhausting, requiring her to constantly revisit traumatic experiences and confront the reality of violent crime on a daily basis. She identified several younger advocates who could eventually take over leadership of the foundation. Women who had their own experiences with the criminal justice system and who shared her commitment to ensuring that no case was ever truly closed until justice was served. The transition process would take several years, but Jean was confident that the foundation would continue its work long after she was no longer able to lead it personally. In 2020, as the 24th anniversary of Crystal's death approached, Jean made a decision that surprised many of the people who knew her story. She announced that she was stepping back from day-to-day operations of the foundation and moving to a small town in North Carolina to be closer to her sister's family. "I've spent my whole adult life fighting for justice," she explained to a reporter who called to ask about her decision. "And I'm grateful that I was able to make a difference, that Crystal's name is attached to legislation that has helped solve so many cases. But I'm ready to have a quieter life now, to be a grandmother and an aunt instead of an advocate." The decision was not an easy one. Jean had built her identity around the fight for justice, and stepping away from that role felt like another kind of loss. But she also recognized that she had accomplished what she set out to do. Crystal's killer had been caught and punished, and her daughter's name was permanently attached to efforts to solve cold cases and help other families. Jean's final official act as president of the Crystal Jean Baker Foundation was to attend the graduation ceremony at Sam Houston State University's College of Criminal Justice, where she presented the annual scholarship awards to 6 students who were beginning their careers in law enforcement and forensic science. Crystal never got to graduate from anything, Jean said during her remarks to the graduating class. She never got to walk across a stage and receive recognition for her hard work and dedication. But through these scholarships, through the work that you will do in your careers, her name will live on. She will touch cases she never knew about, help families she never met, and make sure that no one is ever forgotten. The speech was Jean's public goodbye to the advocacy work that had defined the final decade of her active life. As she drove away from the university that evening, she felt a sense of completion that had eluded her even after Smith's conviction. Crystal's story was no longer just a personal tragedy. It had become part of a larger movement toward justice that would continue long after Jean was gone. In her new home in North Carolina, Jean kept a photo of Crystal on her mantle, next to pictures of her sister's grandchildren and a framed copy of the Crystal Jean Baker Act. The image showed Crystal at age 12, laughing at something outside the camera's view, her whole life ahead of her in that frozen moment before everything went wrong. But Jean no longer looked at the photo with the crushing grief that had defined so many years of her life. Instead, she saw evidence of a life that had mattered, a daughter whose death had sparked changes that helped other families find the justice that had seemed impossible during those first terrible years after the murder. On quiet evenings, Jean would sit on her front porch and watch the sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, thinking about the long journey that had brought her to this peaceful place. Crystal would have been 37 years old in 2020. Perhaps a mother herself, perhaps a teacher or artist or whatever she had dreamed of becoming during her 13 years of life. Jean had learned to live with the loss of those unrealized dreams, but she had also learned something else during her 24-year journey toward justice and healing. She had learned that love could be stronger than grief, that persistence could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles, and that even the most terrible crimes could be transformed into forces for positive change. Crystal Jean Baker's life had been tragically short, but her impact on the world would continue for generations through the legislation that bore her name, the cases it helped solve, and the families it helped heal. In the end, that legacy was perhaps the greatest victory Jean could have achieved, not just justice for her own daughter, but hope for countless other families who were still waiting for their own answers to emerge from the darkness. 25 years after that terrible morning in March 1996, Texas City had grown and changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to Jean Baker during those first dark months after Crystal's murder. New subdivisions sprawled where cotton fields had once stretched toward the horizon, and the downtown area had been revitalized with trendy restaurants and boutique shops that catered to young professionals working at the expanding petrochemical plants. But some things remained constant. The Trinity River still flowed toward Galveston Bay, carrying the detritus of human civilization toward the Gulf. The bridge where Crystal's body had been found still carried traffic between Chambers and Harris counties, though most drivers never knew about the tragedy that had unfolded in its shadow a quarter-century earlier. Detective Miguel Ramirez, now a captain in the Chambers County Sheriff's Department, occasionally drove past the memorial garden that had been established in Crystal's honor near the site where she was found. The small park featured native Texas plants, a stone bench, and a plaque that read, "In memory of Crystal Jean Baker and all victims of violent crime." May their voices never be silenced. The garden was maintained by volunteers from local churches and community organizations, part of a network of memorial sites that had grown up around the Gulf Coast in recognition of the region's long history of unsolved crimes and disappeared children. It served as a reminder that some stories have endings, even when those endings come decades after they should have. Kevin Edison Smith remained in the Polunsky unit near Huntsville, serving his life sentence in the general population of one of Texas's most secure prisons. He had never appealed his conviction, never sought to overturn the DNA evidence that had finally connected him to Crystal's murder. Prison records showed that he was a model inmate, quiet, compliant, and largely invisible among the thousands of men serving long sentences for violent crimes. He had never expressed remorse for his crime and never acknowledged the devastation he had caused to Jean Baker and her family. In the rare interviews he had granted to journalists and researchers studying cold case investigations, Smith maintained that he had no memory of the events of the 5th of March, 1996, claiming that alcohol and drug abuse had left large gaps in his recollection of that period in his life. But those who knew the case best, Ramirez, Bennett, the investigators who had built the prosecution, suspected that Smith remembered everything about the day he murdered Crystal Baker. His claim of memory loss was simply another form of denial, a way of avoiding responsibility for actions that had destroyed multiple lives and shattered a community's sense of safety. The Crystal Jean Baker Act had exceeded even Jean's most optimistic expectations for its impact on cold case investigations. By 2021, the legislation had resulted in the resolution of over 800 unsolved cases across Texas, leading to hundreds of convictions and bringing closure to families who had waited decades for answers. The success in Texas had inspired similar legislation in 23 other states, creating a national movement towards systematic review of cold cases and application of modern forensic techniques to evidence that had been collected years or even decades earlier. The FBI estimated that advances in DNA technology, combined with legislative mandates for regular case review, had cleared more cold cases in the previous 5 years than in the previous 20 combined. Dr. Sarah Chen, the forensic scientist whose DNA analysis had finally identified Crystal's killer, had been promoted to director of the state crime lab and had become a national expert on cold case investigations. She frequently spoke at conferences about the Crystal Baker case as an example of how persistence and advancing technology could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles to justice. This case changed how we think about evidence preservation and cold case review, Dr. Chen told a gathering of forensic scientists in 2020. It showed that cases are never really closed, they're just waiting for the right combination of science and opportunity to reveal their secrets. Pastor Ray Holloway had retired from active ministry but continued to visit Jean during her occasional trips back to Texas City. Their friendship had deepened over the years, bonded by their shared experience of witnessing Jean's transformation from grieving mother to national advocate for victims' rights. She turned her pain into purpose. Pastor Holloway reflected during a sermon about resilience and redemption. That's what faith looks like in action, not the absence of suffering, but the determination to make something meaningful from the suffering we can't avoid. Claire Bennett had been elected district attorney of Chambers County in 2018, running on a platform that emphasized the importance of cold case investigations and victim advocacy. Her successful prosecution of Kevin Smith had launched her political career, but she remained committed to the principle that had guided her work on the case, that every victim deserves justice, regardless of how much time has passed since their death. Reporter Tessa Clark had written a book about the Crystal Baker case, titled The Long Wait, DNA, Justice, and the Power of a Mother's Love. The book became a bestseller and was optioned for a television movie, though Jean had mixed feelings about seeing her story dramatized for mass entertainment. "I'm glad people remember Crystal," Jean said during a phone interview about the book adaptation. "But I hope they remember her as more than just a victim. She was a real person with dreams and hopes and a future that was stolen from her. That's what I want people to understand." Louise Baker had passed away peacefully in 2017 at the age of 91. She had lived long enough to see Smith convicted and to witness the early success of the Crystal Jean Baker Act, finding some measure of peace in the knowledge that her granddaughter's death had led to positive changes in how the criminal justice system handled cold cases. In her final years, Louise had often spoken about the morning Crystal left the house, wondering if different words or actions might have changed the course of events. But with the wisdom that sometimes comes with advanced age, she had eventually reached a kind of acceptance about the limitations of human foresight and the reality that some tragedies cannot be prevented, only endured and ultimately transformed into something that serves the greater good. The ripple effects of Crystal's case continued to spread in ways that Jean could never have anticipated during those dark years when justice seemed impossible. Police departments across the country had revised their evidence preservation protocols, ensuring that biological material from unsolved cases would be maintained under conditions that maximize the chances of future DNA analysis. Law schools now taught courses on cold case investigation techniques, using the Crystal Baker case as an example of how persistence, technology, and effective advocacy could overcome the limitations that had historically left many violent crimes unsolved. A generation of prosecutors, detectives, and forensic scientists was learning from Jean's experience, carrying forward the lessons that had emerged from 24 years of searching for justice. The scholarship program established by the Crystal Jean Baker Foundation had supported over 200 students pursuing careers in criminal justice and forensic science. Many of these young professionals were now working in law enforcement agencies, crime labs, and prosecutors' offices across the country, carrying Crystal's name into investigations in courtrooms where her story continued to inspire efforts to solve seemingly impossible cases. Dr. Maria Santos, who had received the first Crystal Jean Baker Scholarship in 2016, was now a DNA analyst at the FBI crime lab in Quantico. She kept a small photo of Crystal on her desk as a reminder of why her work mattered, of the families who were still waiting for the kind of breakthrough that had finally brought justice to the Baker family. Every sample I process could be the one that solves a case, Dr. Santos explained to visitors touring the lab. Every analysis could be the key that finally unlocks the truth that someone has been hiding for years or decades. That's what keeps me going when the work gets difficult, knowing that somewhere, a family is waiting for the answers that science might be able to provide. As 2021 marked the 25th anniversary of Crystal's murder, Jean Baker looked back on a quarter-century that had encompassed the worst and best of human nature. She had witnessed the depths of evil that Kevin Smith represented, but she had also seen the dedication of investigators like Miguel Ramirez, the skill of scientists like Sarah Chen, and the support of countless strangers who had been moved by Crystal's story to donate time, money, and effort to the cause of justice. The annual memorial service for Crystal was smaller now than it had been during the years immediately following her murder, but it continued to draw people who understood that some stories deserve to be remembered, that some lives have meaning beyond their tragic endings. Jean attended virtually in 2021, speaking via video conference from her home in North Carolina to the small gathering assembled at the Memorial Garden in Texas City. Crystal has been gone longer now than she was alive, Jean said during her remarks, but her impact on the world continues to grow. Every case solved under the law that bears her name, every family that finds closure because of the changes she inspired, that's Crystal's real legacy. That's how we know her life mattered. After the memorial service ended, Jean sat quietly in her living room, looking at the photographs and mementos that chronicled her journey from devastated mother to national advocate. The path had been longer and more difficult than anything she could have imagined on that terrible morning in March 1996, but it had led to a place of peace that seemed impossible during the darkest years of her search for justice. Outside her window, the Blue Ridge Mountains caught the last light of another day, their ancient peaks a reminder that some things endure despite the human tragedies that unfold in their shadows. Jean had learned to find comfort in such permanent things, mountains and rivers, the changing seasons, the love that persists even after death separates families. Crystal Jean Baker would have been 45 years old in 2021, perhaps a grandmother herself, perhaps pursuing the teaching career she had dreamed about during her 13 years of life. But the woman she might have become was less important now than the changes her death had inspired, the lives that had been saved by the legislation bearing her name, and the families who had found justice because Jean Baker refused to let her daughter be forgotten. In the end, that refusal had been Jean's greatest gift to her daughter and to the world, the insistence that some stories are too important to be abandoned, that some truths are too essential to remain hidden, and that love can be stronger than grief when it is channeled toward a purpose larger than personal pain. The phone calls and emails still came occasionally, families seeking advice about cold cases, students writing papers about victims' rights legislation, journalists working on stories about advances in forensic science. Jean continued to offer help when she could, but more often now she referred people to the professionals who had taken over the day-to-day operations of the foundation. Her active role in the movement she had helped create was largely finished, but the movement itself would continue long after she was gone. The Crystal Jean Baker Act would remain part of Texas law. The scholarship program would continue supporting young forensic scientists, and somewhere in evidence rooms across the country, DNA samples collected from old crimes would eventually yield the profiles that brought killers to justice. That was enough. After 25 years of fighting for justice, Jean Baker had earned the right to a quieter life, to peaceful evenings on her front porch, and the simple pleasure of watching her great-nieces and great-nephews grow up in a world that was slightly safer because of the work that had grown from her daughter's death. Crystal Jean Baker's life had been brutally short, but her story would continue as long as there were families seeking justice, investigators refusing to give up, and scientists pushing the boundaries of what evidence could reveal about crimes that seemed impossible to solve. In that continuation lay the real victory, not just the conviction of Kevin Smith, not just the passage of legislation, but the transformation of tragedy into hope, of loss into purpose, and of one mother's grief into a force that would help countless other families find the answers they deserved. The sun set over the Blue Ridge Mountains, ending another day in a life that had been irreparably changed by violence but ultimately defined by the determination to ensure that love was stronger than hate, that truth was more powerful than concealment, and that justice, however delayed, was always worth pursuing.